I'm John Britton.
And I'm Angela Jameson, and together we've created the School of Humankind.
We'd like to welcome you to Humanity, where Angela, I, and sometimes other guests get ourselves a cup of tea and talk about the things that matter, how to be human in a really complicated world. Good morning to you, Angela.
Good afternoon, John.
How lovely to see you again, as always.
As always, my voice is scratchy today. I apologize.
Well, I was directing a community theatre show, which I also had to perform in. Uh, so my voice is a little bit gravelly. We performed outdoors in the wonderful landscape of the
Ooh.
Fanad Peninsula, and it did not rain, which was
Wow.
miraculous, but it threatened rain, but it was quite windy and you had to talk very loud above the wind. So I've got a slightly scratchy voice too.
Okay, well, your scratchy voice will go with my voice that is currently speaking in chords. I feel like I can hear three tones.
That's very impressive. A
Thank you.
form of throat singing, Tuavan or Mongolian throat singing, coming
That's right.
all the way from Saskatoon.
That's
Go on,
right.
what you drinking? What you drinking this morning, Angela?
It's probably going to be boring to you, but I'm just having masala chai.
One of your favorites, huh?
It is. It's very warming. And believe it or not, right now in Saskatoon, we're having a coolish kind of week. So, yeah, you need a bit of warming from the inside out.
Well, you see, the Irish calendar, the traditional Irish calendar, autumn begins on the 1st of August. So here it is now actually autumn. Uh, and it sort of makes sense because although it's August, there is definitely a sense of the change in the air. The leaves are just beginning to turn. The summer vegetables have pretty much been harvested. The potatoes are ready and all of that stuff. And the same thing because spring starts the 1st of February in the traditional Irish calendar. And although it's really bleak and midwinter, the change is there. The first shoots of a daffodil or, something else are just poking through the ground, the first hints of the buds on the trees and so on. So it's actually autumn here now.
Hmm.
And I'm on an experiment for me with tea. I just bought, and literally I have not yet tasted it because I've just made it. I just bought a packet of hawthorn tea. So
Get out.
hawthorn
Hawthorn.
is very good for cardiovascular health, which is good for me, of course. It's good for anxiety. But it's very laden with mythology in Ireland. The hawthorn is was given by, I can't remember whom, to the wee folk, to the fairies. And there's a whole set of things about you don't bring hawthorn into the house, you don't carry hawthorn branches into the house because the fairies will get upset, the wee folk will get upset. But I want to this autumn harvest hawthorn because we've got masses of it. We've got hedges all the way around the garden. I want to harvest hawthorn and make hawthorn ink and hawthorn teas and so on. It's very healthy. So good for you.
Nothing, nothing is safe in your sight. You're just going to make everything into ink.
Absolutely. Well, I found some charcoal at the back of the stove as I was sort of getting it ready for the winter. So I've made some charcoal ink and I made some peat ink. So not out of something called peat. I mean, out of peat that, like comes from the soil.
Yes,
It'd
poor
be a bit of a
Pete.
shame if my next door neighbour was called Pete and I turned him into ink. I've got some peat ink and now, Angela, come on over. I want to make some Angela ink.
Yes, exactly.
I'll
I'll
crush
donate
you.
my little finger. You
I'll
don't
cru-
need any more than that.
Absolutely not. And I'll just boil it for about 8 hours to extract
Yeah.
pigment. And then, anyway, so
Anyway, we
I'm on the
digress.
hawthorn tea. Don't we always digress?
So,
Um,
John, fun little side thing.
yeah,
I'm starting a new fiction series, and I'm
yeah.
calling it Hawthorne House.
Are you serious?
Yes, but it was just out of the blue. So I was just thinking, as you're talking, I want to incorporate some of those elements
You
into a
be
book you will never read.
absolutely be aware of the wee folk own
Yes.
hawthorn. And if you don't want to upset the wee folk are powerful and they're wonderful and they are very, very ancient. But, if they're on your side, everything's good. And if they're not, you'll know about it. So.
Okay, I'm going to weave that in.
Yeah, there's going to be little green figures in the corner of the rooms as all sorts of unmentionable things happen.
That's right. That's right. Okay, well, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so today we're going to talk about something which is a little bit of a complicated one, I think, in some ways. Certainly it is
I
for
think
me.
it could be like a 10-part series.
Yeah, absolutely. But personally, also personally for me, complicated, and maybe for you, which is family dynamics.
Ah,
So there is a famous poem by Philip Larkin, which is about family dynamics. And if you will forgive my language, but I'm allowed to swear because this is poetry. It starts, they fuck you up, your mum and dad. They do not mean to, but they do. And so it carries on. It's a very, very good
oh,
poem, actually.
so that poem really spoke to you then, hey?
It really did. It was, I thought, he was a librarian at the university where I did my undergraduate degree. So I did occasionally see him wandering around. He was towards the end of his life then. I once went up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Larkin," he said, "sod off." Okay.
Oh,
He was
I
not a
can
friend.
I can see how he writes his poetry.
Yeah, he was not a friendly chap, but he was a very good poet. So there we go. So we're talking family dynamics.
And before we started this, what I liked is, we were mulling around what we're going to talk about, and you said, "This feels difficult. Let's do it." So, with that spirit, let's go.
Yeah. Is it difficult for you? Difficult
Yeah,
topic for you? Okay.
for sure. And I think every family has some interesting parts to it. So, I think one of the precursors to this talk is we don't want to throw anyone under the bus
No.
because ultimately a family is a interesting mosaic of individuals who help shape, what is interesting about you. Um, they're probably one of the first people to show you what you like and what you don't like, how you like to speak and how you don't like to speak. And when I became a parent, it was one of those, I have three children and they're all quite different. And it always made me think, how does this happen when they're so different, but they come from the same house, the same parents. But I do see differences in how we parent our children.
Right.
The firstborn to the lastborn, and because it's so prevalent in our society, I don't think we're alone in it. We learn more. The first child is like, oh my goodness, the golden child we're expecting, and they get the best of the best, and they get all of your time and interest and everything. I mean, this is broadly speaking.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
a lot of people who are brought into nothingness. And then the last child, you've got more experience and you don't fret so much.
For you, your eldest is a girl and your two younger
Yeah.
are boys, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Was there a very either conscious or not deliberate difference in the way that was gender that you treated the boys and the girls differently, or do you think the primary difference was, whether they were firstborn, secondborn, or thirdborn?
I think the biggest difference was their personality.
Right.
Um, and, I was getting more experience as I had them,
Mhm.
also getting more tired. That's why the third one is just like, go ahead, eat that dirt, which is good for you anyway. Um, but you always try to protect your first one from everything, or what my fatal flaw with my first one was I entertained her nonstop. Like I was the most entertaining person in the room to her,
Mhm.
and I needed to flip and leave her alone. But, I was also full-time working, so it's not like I damaged her for that long. I had to go to work.
Right, right. Yeah, and for you growing up, do you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have an older sister, younger brother. I think most of my family issues come from my external to my current nucleus family. And as I'm thinking about it, it's one of those. I am probably oblivious to how my kids would talk about our family, like in terms of the silly things I do or the failings I have, or I think they would speak maybe differently than I consider it because I run my household in a certain way.
Mm.
So then it's all right to me.
Yeah.
So that's probably shielding me from telling you, oh, my house sucks. Although there are elements of that because, yeah, everyone fails here and there. But I think when we get older and we see our own parents and we maybe judge them for what they did to us because it wasn't ideal, or, our siblings who are now external to us, or, our extended family, like nieces, nephews, in-laws.
Mm.
There's there's a reason why, there's a in-law stigma. But yeah, kind of as I remember when my dad died, I kind of regret saying this at his funeral, but it was one of those what I said was he wasn't the perfect dad, but he was the perfect dad for me.
Mm.
And what I he was the perfect dad for me, but I shouldn't have said he wasn't the perfect dad. But you know what I mean?
It's
Externally, you would say he wasn't, but he was perfect for me because he trained me in certain ways.
mm.
Anyway,
It's
sorry.
no, it's interesting. There's a lot of things in there I want to pick up on because they're really important, I think. But just on the funeral thing, it's interesting. I gave the eulogy at my mother's funeral, um, and I was really quite honest about a lot of the things that she had never spoken about, namely that she came from really desperate poverty. And, somebody like some people do, having come from desperate poverty, that wasn't something she was proud of. That's something she tried to hide. She desperately wanted people to think that she was, vaguely middle class and a little bit sophisticated and so on. And in that sense, she was a snob. She became a snob.
Mm,
Which me growing up, particularly as I was going through my radical Marxist phase, found intensely upsetting and annoying and embarrassing. But of course, it's entirely understandable. I mean, she was so desperate, not only to leave behind where she came from, but for it not to be known, partly because it damaged the image she wanted to present of herself to the world, but also because when she was growing up, because my mum was born in the early 1920s, she was pretty old when I was born, and my dad was even older. If people found you didn't belong to the middle class, you got sent back to where you came from. You would never be accepted.
oh,
So,
yeah.
so for her, it was life and death. This is she was brought up in England, and in a rigid class-based society. And so I really get it now, but I hated it with a passion growing up. We didn't, she didn't talk to us much. My father even less about where they came from. I know very little about I don't actually know for sure who my grandfather was on my mother's side. Quite possibly she doesn't know for sure who her father was. I know almost nothing about my father's family because there was unspoken but a sense of immense shame
Mm,
within the family, which, it comes to this interesting thing about family dynamics. Now, I mean, my father, who was a difficult man, but he came from an artisanal background. His father, I believe, was an artisanal carpenter. He carved,
mm,
he carved, not just made tables, but carved doors and things like this. And my father and his sister, And I believe there was a lot of alcohol in the house as well. I believe there was significant, addiction problems and abuse problems and so on. Uh, but both my father and his sister, back in the 1920s, managed to get to Oxford University, which was
Wow.
really going at well. They weren't letting many women in at all at that point, and they certainly weren't
Right.
letting working class people in. In fact, I did once hear a story from my mother, and I believe it to be true, that my father won the scholarship from the city of Bath to
Mm,
Oxford, and when they discovered the scholarship had gone to a working class person, they said, "Well, we will give you the money, but you'll have to repay it once you got,"
really?
because they were ashamed that a working class or lower middle class, but let's call working class artisanal boy would be representing Bath at Oxford because it was
Huh.
all aristocrats and so on. So, enormous achievements. He was a leading scientist in the 1930s, working for Marconi on radar, the cutting edge. He wrote books and so on. Then he had a car crash and spent the rest of his life as a teacher, perfectly honourable profession. But undoubtedly, it was fear and shame that made him keep his head down from about the age of 30 onwards. And my mother also, left school at 14, illiterate, all of this stuff, and became a nurse, did extraordinary things. There was no cause for shame. And,
Right.
and yet we lived a story of unspoken shame.
Yeah.
And then me, the next generation, found myself in at war with the shame that I didn't want to feel. And that as I grew slightly older, I realized should never have been felt by anyone in the family. So it's a very complex dynamic because you need your parents. They are the shell within which you grow. And then you begin to go, but you're flawed and you're
Yeah.
wrong about that. And that wasn't the best way to do it. I remember clearly we were driving up a little hill on the way into Llandudno in North Wales, which is close to where we lived. And I was sitting in the back seat, my brother sitting in the front seat, my dad driving. And my dad said something to my brother, and I don't know how old I was, probably 8 or 9 or 10 or something. And I remember thinking, what he's saying is factually wrong. He's just said something which is wrong. And my dad wasn't the sort of person who'd say that's wrong. But
Right.
it's the first time I remember going, hold on, he gets things wrong. He makes mistakes. He's not the oracle. And I remember it. I mean, it's now, whatever, 40, so 50 years later. And I
Few
still
years ago.
remember it, a little half century or so. And I remember it really clearly of going, my God, there are cracks in this security and this safety.
And that's what I was going to ask you is when you were talking about your mother's snobbery, when did you realize that she was a snob? Because as you just said, your parents create this kind of cocoon for you that this is what life is about. You're growing up in this. This is this envelope of reality. And then how did you, so this was your moment with your dad where you realized, oh, this is maybe not everything and all that I should consider.
Yeah, the realization around so that with my dad, that was sort of going, okay, factually speaking, they're not always right. And that was interesting. The the realization that it's sort of what you might all call an emotional separation from the family dynamic uh, came after I left home and go to university. I went to university in Hull, which is a working class town, and um, I had had a relatively socially cocooned upbringing because my dad was a teacher in a boarding school and I was sent to boarding school, and there's a relatively small dynamic there. And even though I'd had an utterly miserable time at boarding school, uh, and by boarding school standards would have been considered non-conformist and radical, you know, it was a very narrow spectrum of what's conformist and what isn't. When I went to Hull, I encountered radical art, radical theatre, radical music, radical people, radical politics. I discovered there were vast swathes of society that I had never imagined existed. And I went wholeheartedly into very, transgressive arts, transgressive performance, radical Marxist politics, and so on, radical literature. And that was when I then turned back to my family and went, my God, what is it that you are defending and have tried to teach me to defend?
Right,
But
right.
they weren't bad people.
No,
And it's really, sometimes I think it's hard for us to um, really hold these things in mind at the same time. I remember my father, so this is going to sound awful, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it for my father and about my mother. Uh, Remember my father, at one point I was talking about, disabled people. I said, why shouldn't a disabled person, why shouldn't someone in a wheelchair play Hamlet? This was after I'd left, home and gone home. He said, would someone who's been in a wheelchair have the life experience to understand Hamlet? And he was a very decent and in some ways very liberal man. But that was how he grew up. And the same with my mother, she was not racist. But she said, "Oh, well, I wouldn't mind who you married, but if you had children with a black person or an Indian person, I'd be worried for them," which, of course, is a whole set of racist assumptions. But my mother wasn't racist. She was coming out of that place. And
yeah,
so I go, well, I had a mother a father who was, anti-disabled and a mother who was a racist. It's nonsense. It's these things are not true and yet are also in some ways true. And balancing that set of experiences, who I became, who I am still becoming, with where I came from, and yet realizing that my parents were so they were good people, often emerging from toxic contexts. And you don't emerge from a toxic context by stopping being toxic. It's all very well to go, oh, just be nice. It's in you.
you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so many other pressures and expectations from society. I mean, and that's where all of the disabled and racist concerns that your parents had is is sort of stemmed from that.
Mm,
It's like you said, they're not bad people, but they're speaking from society.
mm. It's a negotiating. I suppose many people, I don't know if this is true for your relationship with particularly your parents, or how you see it manifesting in your children's relationship with you, which is, of course, a set of relationships I don't have. I don't have children. Uh, but negotiating that residue of love and gratitude that comes from, them being the people who brought you into the world and supported you and, cared for you. And the growing realization that you are different to them and may not even very much like them at times is quite hard. That's quite difficult.
It is. Um, and so I guess, if you knew my dad, he was, um, he's born out of seeing his parents have extreme wealth and then have it all taken away during the, um, what did they call it? But the Japanese sort of came and invaded and took
All
over
right.
for a bit. So I think there was some anger about that. And then he had to build from nothing.
Mm.
So the parents were so wealthy, he was sent to live with other people. I don't know how that works, but he he grew up separate from them, but seeing this immense wealth, and then having to, when the Japanese came, he had to look for food in the form of chicken feed. He would scrounge
Mm.
around for that. So extreme difficulty. And then he knew that education was his way out. So he studied like a demon, often famished, very weakened because he had no food. The people that were taking care of him didn't take very good care of him. And so he managed to secure a scholarship to take him away from, the reality that was his life. So long story short, he ends up in Canada again on a scholarship. And the interesting thing is, well, I guess the thing that I saw first, because he always kept this inside of him, he was generally a strict guy, but also, for instance, I loved athletics. I loved being, on a team. I loved basketball when I was young. When I got into high school, he didn't allow me to play sports, which was a bummer because I was asked in grade 9, they said, "Do you want to join the grade 10
Mhm.
basketball team?" And I thought, that's kind of a big honor. But it was when my dad said no. And because he thought it was so difficult for him to try to get a place in university that I must focus on my studies so that I
Sure.
can get a place. But it's like here in Saskatchewan, you can get a place. you know, there is no shortage. So that was one really big difference that I saw. But John, and I don't know if it's the same for you. As hard as my dad was, and I mean, that's not even a big example, but when he died, I couldn't think of anything bad about him.
Mm.
I don't know if that's a universal thing, but I feel like when someone dies, it's just love, no matter how weird they were. and and I know my dad loved me. Uh, and I know what he came from in terms of heard a few stories, but I don't know that hardship, right? So a lot of times you just say he shaped me into who I am today. And yeah, I've got faults, but it's kind of cool to be who I am. I like the world that I'm living in. I like the way I view the world. Maybe it's
Mm.
a little rose colored. Um, but yeah, he was a huge influence. And like your parents, they don't my parents didn't talk to us a lot. And this is what I find interesting. And my mom is a remarkable person as well. She's still with with us. So she's an entrepreneur. She's a risk taker. She just she's this little lady who's drives a big pickup truck and helps people move beds. She's 83. She's nuts. But she's really a beacon of who you can be. She's sort of the person who says, just do it.
Mm.
So my more conservative dad and my crazy risk taking mom were often at odds. So we did grow up in a little bit of a conflict filled house, but I never took it on as myself. It was more of like, oh, they're just arguing, which is kind of why I didn't learn Chinese because they are they argued in Chinese. And so when people are arguing, you just block them out, right? Especially if
Yeah.
you don't understand everything. But yeah, that's
I
that's one of
love I
my
love that. That is your entire excuse for not speaking
it
Chinese.
is. I just
You can't
ignored
bear to
them.
hear people arguing. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
so
It's very interesting. The thing you say about uh, you could think of nothing bad about your father. It was very different for me.
huh.
That my father died when 2001, so 25 years ago. So I would have been 35, I suppose. Is that right? Yeah, 35, about 36, 37. I couldn't really think about much that was good about him in the
Really?
when he died. I was,
Okay.
I was, it was very complicated time because, he had been failing for a long time, and my mother as a nurse had tried to support him, but she also was an old-fashioned nurse. So I felt that I kind of wanted to allow him to be allowed to slip away quietly because he was very clearly, and she wasn't having it. She was, she once said to me, "Death for me is always a failure." And I just think that's an
What?
awful. Well, for her as a nurse, she said, if somebody dies, I failed.
Oh, true.
So, and but I hated it. But when he died, I couldn't really think of much that was good about him. But in the decades afterwards, particularly as I've actually grown to be really rather more like him in a lot of ways. He, I look like him, and he was
Ah,
he was. I mean, a lot of the things that I now recognize in myself, I see in myself are things I recognize from him. Desire for solitude, quietness, a certain kind of very, vulnerable romanticism. I cry very easily at music and art and things, and so did he. But he was also of an age where he never showed that, but it was still who he was. And he wrote poetry but would never let anyone read it, even though he was a science teacher and so on. So, I reckon I've become more like him. And in the decades since he's died, I have come deeply to respect him. I'm still not sure I very much liked him,
hmm,
but I deeply, deeply respect him. And I have enormous gratitude because something that you were sort of alluding to in what you were saying. If he hadn't been who he was, I would not be who I am. And that's flaws and all. You know,
yeah,
the difficulties he brought into being a parent, he wasn't a natural parent in all sorts of ways. The difficulties he had with it are part of what formed me into who I am. So to regret my father or my mother is to regret myself. And while there are things that I go, I wish that things were different for me. I wish I wasn't, have this proclivity for anxiety and all of this stuff. But at the same time, if you go too far down that path, you start saying, I wish I was someone else.
yeah.
And I don't wish I was someone else.
You're perfect just the way you are.
Well, very kind of you to say so. But one of the eight principles of presence that I work with, usually the first one I would introduce when I'm teaching a group, is right here, right now, you're good enough. Uh, Another way of putting that is you're perfect.
Yeah,
Either we are all perfect or nobody is perfect. Now, I would actually argue nobody is perfect because nothing is perfect. There's no such thing as perfection. But if there's no such thing as perfection, we might as well feel good about ourselves and admit that we're all perfect. My
yeah,
three-legged, one-eyed cat is perfect, It's a perfect three-legged, one-eyed cat. And with all my flaws, I'm perfect. And I am exactly who I am in my perfection or my good enoughness because of what my father and my mother gave to me. And that's because of, the appalling things that happened to them when they were growing up. And I'm not
yeah,
saying that makes it okay. I'm not glad that my mother went through what she went through, which was tough, the sort of stories that you blanch at when you hear them. I'm not glad she went through that. But at the same time, it made her who she was. It was, we talked in another episode about it, was the grit, the struggle that formed her into the resilient, 90-something-year-old that she was, who had made an extraordinary life for herself from what could have been, you know, the illiterate 14-year-old daughter of a alcoholic mother in a
yeah.
dysfunctional, broken home, all of that. She made a life for herself. And
She
I
did.
think it would be really patronizing of me to go, oh, the poor thing. Oh, I feel sorry for her. I think I go, good on you, woman. She wasn't enormously easy to love, but good on you. And maybe acceptance and respect are more important than love. I don't know. In this context, in the sense
in this
of
context.
in the
And
family.
but then when you have that acceptance and respect, it is a kind of love, you
Yeah.
know? Um, and then something that popped into my mind when you were talking was when you are shown a complete dark spot in life, for instance, something your parents believed or the way they were, when you discover the exact opposite, when you discover that life doesn't have to be a certain way, that there
Mm,
is beauty, that there is gloriousness,
mm,
then having come from that darkness makes that jump even more delicious.
yeah. And that brings us to something which I meant to pick up on from what you were saying when you were talking earlier. A significant, it seems to me, reason why family dynamics are so difficult is because the role of the parent, and indeed of the elder brother or sister or younger brother, sister, whatever, is to give you something to react against.
Yeah,
It's to go, hear what you say, and when I'm 8, I will accept it, and when I'm 12, I'll question it, and then when I'm 16, I'll reject it. I will become who I am by rejecting you. And the role of the parent then has to be, I will be someone who is prepared and willing and glad to be rejected. And that's really tough, isn't it? I mean, I don't know, but I'm guessing that, if
oh
do
yeah,
you experience your children sort of rejecting you on, small or big levels, just going, no, sorry, that's not who I am and not how I want to be.
yeah, for sure. And I was reflecting on that, like, my parents were more authoritarian, do what I say. So then as me, I'm trying to please my parents. This is part of my origin story of why I needed to rediscover myself later. But you're always a pleaser to parents like that. I don't
Mhm.
it's the weird parent-child relationship that you always want to make them happy. Um, and that as that goes through your life, I can see how that transfers to a boss, to a teacher, to a boss as I went along. And then, I did break out of that in terms of having my independent thought a little later in life, maybe in university-ish. But it is a base feeling that I always have to check myself. So from my parents who went from authoritarian, I'm now having these children who I do want to please, which is kind of an odd thing to happen in one generation, so they become very independent thinkers, maybe because their nest is feathered and they can explore the world, which is great. But we'll have family discussions and they'll correct my husband and I. They're so accepting of everything. They so believe on a base level that everyone um, has a place. And I do believe that too. But we also come with these society things, kind of like what your parents were dealing with, the and my feelings about it are much less, but my kids are that extra level open.
Yeah. That feels to me really profound what you're saying, because also for people of, I mean, I'm a wee bit older than you, a decade or something, but for people of our sort of generation, many of us have been through a politics where we have moved towards, embracing anti-racism and, embracing, disability access and queer rights and all of that stuff. And I believe in that stuff so passionately. I spent my whole life feeling that what I was trying to do in one way or another was advocate for progressive politics through my art and through all of it. And yet I come from a racist, sexist,
Yeah,
discriminatory social structure. And, those thinking structures are still part of how I think. I find myself sometimes saying something and going, oh, hold on, that's set based on a set of discriminatory assumptions and so on. And so in many ways, the family dynamic is that the parents lay down stories and one hopes lay them down in such a way that the children can then learn from those stories and move beyond them and reject the bits that don't serve them because the parents are always laying down the stories that were laid down to them. They've also
Yeah.
developed them. But so you end up with that thing, I can't remember the full extent of the Philip Larkin poem we started with, but they fuck you up, your mum and dad. They do not mean to, but they do. Um, uh, and they say something like they give you all the it's something like they give you all the pains that they were given and then make up some extra ones just for you. So
Yeah.
it's that sense that they come carrying uh,
Yeah.
pain and
Yeah.
then they create more with their children because they are carrying pain and so on. It's an extraordinary poem. It's very short, but it's very powerful.
Mm.
Um, and for someone like you as a parent, or just for me as someone coming out of I don't want to say dysfunctional family, it was no more dysfunctional than any other family, but out of not an easy background, it is that question of recognizing the story that we carry and choosing which parts of it we want to carry forward and which parts we want to be really watchful of and say, no, I learned that with my mother's milk, but that doesn't make it true. I'm not going to
Yeah.
believe that anymore.
Yeah. And that's a huge realization in
Mm.
life, is to to break apart from that. That's huge. Just a quick example, because I'm, a female engineer that's still male dominated.
Mhm.
Uh, my husband and I went overseas based on my career, and he was the accompanying spouse, which most of our friends, it was the other way around. And I remember talking to someone, she was talking about her sister going on a posting, and she was a drilling engineer who are, those are tough people. And I had said something like, "Oh, what does her husband do?" And she kind of looked at me weird and she goes, "She's like you, Angela. She's the breadwinner. This is her career and he's following." And that was such a slap in the face that I judged her that way because that's all I know. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, it's still I'm seeing the world a certain way because that's all I can see. I'm doing my thing, and which I maybe I didn't appreciate how different it was,
Mm.
but my world was still the man's career and the woman's following. So that was a little bit of a realization at that point that I'm kind of stuck in some kind of paradigm as
It's
well.
it's weird, isn't it? Yeah, I mean,
It
in some
is.
ways, you of all people,
I know.
breaking through so many barriers, and then you fail to notice that you've broken through all those barriers.
Yeah, it was it was like one of those out of body moments. Like,
Uh,
what are you thinking, girl?
well, I'm in an out of tea moment.
Yeah, me too. So
I've
we know what that means, although this topic could go forever because
There you go.
we've just talked about parents.
We haven't talked about siblings, cousins, nieces, or really gossipy conversations about the family next door.
Oh,
Oh, don't get me started.
stay tuned.
Hey, let's do it again soon, shall we?
Yes, we shall. Thanks, John.
Have a lovely week.
You too.
Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to know more about School of Humankind, please visit our website at www.schoolofhumankind.com, or you can drop us an email on hello@schoolofhumankind.com. Take care out there.